The cold steel of the dagger felt like a sliver of vengeful ice against Alara's palm. Sweat traced a path down her spine, a chilling counterpoint to the sweltering heat of the throne room. Hundreds of werewolves, packed shoulder to shoulder in their finest silks and leathers, radiated a collective, predatory energy that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Their scents, damp earth, pine, musk, and power, assaulted her, a cacophony she had trained for years to ignore. She was a ghost here. A nobody. A serving girl with downcast eyes and a tray of spiced wine, her own scent smothered by a pungent herbal tincture that burned her skin. It was a flimsy disguise, but it had gotten her this far. It had gotten her within striking distance of the Alpha King. Kaelin of the Blackwood Pack. The Butcher of the Silver Moons. Her family. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat for the dead. For mother. For father. For little Lyra. The names were a prayer, a curse, a litany of purpose that had hollowed her out and filled her back up with nothing but resolve. He was just rising from his massive throne carved of petrified ironwood, his voice a low thunder that silenced the entire hall, as he prepared to give the annual solstice proclamation. He was larger than the legends claimed, a monolith of muscle and authority clad in black wolf pelts and silver fastenings that glinted like cruel stars. His hair was the color of a moonless night, and even from this distance, she could see the piercing, unnerving gold of his eyes as they swept the crowd. This was it. Her one chance. She moved, a fluid motion born of a decade of grief-fueled practice. The tray tilted, goblets clattering to the stone floor. A gasp rippled through the nearest courtiers. It was the perfect distraction. As heads turned toward the sound, she surged forward, weaving through opulent bodies with a grace that belied her simple serving tunic. 3 steps. 2. 1. The dagger was in her hand, the polished blade aimed for the sliver of exposed skin between the collar of his tunic and the heavy pelt on his shoulders. A killing blow. She lunged. And the world fractured. It wasn't his guards who stopped her. They were too slow, caught flat-footed by the audacity of the attack. It was him. His head snapped in her direction a microsecond before she moved, those golden eyes locking onto hers. And in that instant, a force slammed into her, more powerful than any physical blow. It was an invisible tidal wave of ozone, lightning, and ancient forest, a scent so overwhelming it buckled her knees. It wasn't just power, it was recognition. A catastrophic, soul-deep clang of a bell that had been silent for millennia. Her wolf, a starved and silent creature she had suppressed since childhood, reared up inside her, howling not in aggression, but in agonizing welcome. Mate! The word was a brand on her soul, a scream in the sudden silence of her mind. Kaelin's eyes widened, his regal composure shattering into raw, disbelieving shock. He saw it too. He felt it. The universe, in its infinite cruelty, had just decreed that the woman trying to murder him was his other half. His momentum carried her forward, but her arm felt like it was moving through solid rock. His power, a crushing, suffocating blanket of pure alpha dominance, pressed down on her, freezing her in place. The dagger, once so sure in her grip, trembled. Her fingers went numb. It slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the dais with a sound that echoed like a death knell in the suddenly silent hall. Guards swarmed her then, rough hands grabbing her arms, pinning her to the ground. The rough wool of her tunic scraped against her cheek, as she was forced face down onto the cold stone. The smells of sweat and fear, her own, finally broke through her herbal shroud. But all she could feel, all she could sense, was him. The Alpha King. Standing over her, his shadow a suffocating eclipse. The bond thrummed between them, a live wire of agony and betrayal. He was breathing hard, each inhalation a ragged tear in the fabric of the room. She could feel his shock, his rage, and beneath it all, a current of profound, world-altering pain that mirrored her own. He stared down at her, This slip of a girl who reeked of deception and yet smelled, impossibly, of home. Of completion. The scent of rain on summer dust and the wild, sweet perfume of moon-petal flowers. A scent he'd only ever dreamed of. It was her. The mate the fates had promised him. And she had come to him with a blade. The fury was a physical thing, a black tide rising in his chest, demanding he rip the throat from this traitor. But the bond, the damnable, sacred bond, was a shield around her, screaming at him to protect, to cherish, to claim. The contradiction was tearing him apart. His voice, when it finally came, was sheared of all its earlier warmth. It was a shard of obsidian, honed to a razor's edge. He looked not at her, but at his captain of the guard, his jaw a rigid line of control. Take her away. The command was absolute, yet for the first time in his reign, his voice held a tremor of something other than power. It was the sound of a king, a man, a wolf, whose entire world had just been broken. The guards hauled Alara to her feet. She risked one last look up at him, her heart a gaping wound. His golden eyes were a vortex of conflict, a storm of fury and a devastation so deep it stole her breath. He was the monster who had destroyed her life. And he was the other half of her soul. As they dragged her from the throne room, past the horrified, whispering faces of the court, the only sound she could hear was the echo of his broken command, and the silent, agonized howl of her own wolf, mourning a reunion that was also a death sentence. The dungeons of the Blackwood Keep were carved from the mountain's heart, a place of perpetual cold and dripping silence. The chill seeped into Alara's bones, a welcome numbness after the fiery chaos of the throne room. They'd stripped her of the dagger, her herbal pouch, her dignity, leaving her in a simple linen shift in a cell slick with damp moss. The heavy iron door had slammed shut with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of vengeful glory, but in a cold, dark cage, waiting for the executioner's blade. The irony was a bitter pill in her throat. She had failed. Her family was still unavenged, and she had discovered her soulmate only to have him be the author of her pain. She sank onto the rough stone bench, wrapping her arms around herself, but the cold was internal. The bond was a phantom limb, an ache where a connection should be. It pulsed with his distant rage, his confusion. It was a constant, tormenting reminder of what she'd found and lost in the same heartbeat. Hatred should have been easy. It had been her only companion for 10 years. But now, it was muddled with the bond's unwilling empathy. She could feel the schism in him, the war between the alpha king and the mated wolf. It made her own hatred feel thin, brittle. Hours bled into one another. The only light was a sliver from a torch in the corridor, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on her eyes. She expected guards. She expected the formal reading of her sentence. She did not expect the soft scrape of a key in the lock. The door swung open not with a crash, but a quiet groan, revealing a woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her silver hair braided with sprigs of dried herbs. She carried a small wooden basin and clean cloths. A healer. I am Lyra, the old woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She didn't wait for permission, entering the cell and setting her basin on the bench. The Alpha King commanded that your injuries be tended. Alara flinched away. His pity is as insulting as his cruelty. I want nothing from him. Lyra's eyes, a pale, watery blue, held a startling depth of wisdom. She dipped a cloth into the warm, herb-scented water. It is not pity, child. It is complication. She gestured to the scrapes on Alara's arms and the raw, red marks where the guard's gauntlets had dug into her skin. Allow me. Pain is pain, no matter its source. Reluctantly, Alara held out her arms. The healer's touch was gentle, her movements practiced and sure. As she cleaned the wounds, the scent of willow bark and comfrey filled the small space, a soothing balm against the dungeon's rot. You are a silver moon, Lyra stated, not a question. Alara's breath hitched. How? Your scent. Beneath the bitter herbs, it is still there. Faint. Like a pressed flower in an old book. Rain and moon petals. I knew your mother. Tears pricked Alara's eyes, hot and sudden. Then you know what he did. Lyra paused, her gaze steady and searching. I know what the kingdom was told. I also know that truth is a river with many currents, and a king is not always the sole master of its course. Especially a young king, newly risen and away at war. The words were a riddle, a crack in the perfect, solid edifice of her hatred. A young king, away at war. She remembered the rumors now, from a decade ago. That Kaelin had been securing the treacherous northern marches when the order for the Silver Moon Purge had been given. At the time, she had dismissed it as royalist propaganda. His name was on the decree. That was all that mattered. His seal was on the scroll, Alara whispered, the words tasting like ash. I saw it. Seals can be copied, Lyra said softly, tying a clean bandage around Alara's forearm. Power is a prize many covet, child. And those who seek it will not hesitate to bloody the hands of another to keep their own clean. She finished her work and stood, gathering her basin. At the door, she turned back, her expression one of profound sympathy. Your grief is a righteous storm, Alara. But be certain you are raining it down on the right mountain. The door closed, the lock clicked, and Alara was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was filled with questions. Lyra's words echoed in the darkness, planting a seed of doubt so terrifying it felt like a second betrayal. She had built her entire life on the foundation of Kaelin's guilt. If that foundation was a lie, what was left of her? The bond pulsed, no longer just with his anger, but with a deep, resonating grief that felt ancient and vast. Was it his grief? Or was it her own, finally cracking open? From his seat in the High King's study, Kaelin stared at the document on his desk, the vellum yellowed with age. The royal seal, a snarling wolf's head, was pressed into the wax at the bottom, stark and official. The decree of Silver Moon cleansing. His name was written in a flawless imitation of his own hand. But it wasn't his. He remembered the day it was dated. He'd been 200 leagues north, mired in the blood and snow of the Frostfang Rebellion, fighting to stop an invasion that would have swept through the kingdom. He had mourned the Silver Moons, a peaceful lineage of lawkeepers, told they had been wiped out by a sudden, virulent plague while he was away. A convenient lie. His beater, Rorik, had delivered the news himself upon his return, his face a mask of sorrow. Rorik, who had overseen the capital in his absence. Rorik, whose signature was nowhere on this forged document. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The attempt on his life. The girl, his mate, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that was built on a decade-old lie. Rorik hadn't just murdered her family, he had sharpened her into a weapon and aimed her at Kaelin's own heart. It was a masterful stroke of political treachery. If she had succeeded, Rorik, as beater, would have assumed the throne, hailed as a hero for avenging the fallen king. If she failed, as she had, she was merely a lone assassin, her motives buried with her in an unmarked grave, while Rorik's position remained secure. A low growl rumbled in Kaelin's chest, the sound of a predator recognizing the true threat. He had trusted Rorik since they were pups, had fought beside him, had named him second in his kingdom. The betrayal was a physical wound, deeper than any blade. And Alara, his mate, she was the primary victim of this serpentine plot. He had seen the truth in her eyes, the absolute conviction of her hate. She believed he was a monster. The bond, a raw, open nerve inside him, screamed with her pain, her despair in the dungeons below. Every moment she spent in that cold cell, believing him her family's butcher, was an act of torture against them both. He shoved back from the desk, the heavy chair scraping against the stone floor. His first instinct was to storm down to the dungeons, to drag her out, to tell her everything. But the Alpha King in him tempered the mated wolf's desperation. Rorik was not a fool. He had allies on the council, wolves who had benefited from the Silver Moon's disappearance. To accuse him directly without unshakable proof would be to declare civil war. The kingdom, already fragile after the northern conflict, would shatter. He couldn't risk it. And he couldn't risk Alara. Rorik had used her once. If he discovered the mate bond between her and Kaelin, and with the sense that must have flooded the throne room, it was only a matter of time before rumors started, he would see her not just as a failed weapon, but as Kaelin's greatest vulnerability. He would try to eliminate her permanently. No. He had to move with cunning. He had to protect her, even from herself, even if she hated him for it. He needed her close, where he could watch her, guard her. He needed to unravel Rorik's conspiracy thread by thread, until the entire tapestry of his treason was laid bare for all to see. His wolf paced restlessly inside him, demanding action, demanding he go to his mate. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. Patience was a virtue he rarely practiced, but for her, he would learn. He would bring her out of the darkness of the dungeon, but not into freedom. Not yet. He would place her in a gilded cage, a sanctuary she would see as a prison. It was the only way. He would endure her hatred, her fear, her accusations, because her life was more important than his pride. He finally understood the words of his father, the late king: "The crown is not a prize, my son. It is a burden. And the heaviest part is not its weight on your head, but the weight of the one you must protect above all others." He had found the one. Now, he had to save her from the monster who had already destroyed her world, and from the monster she believed him to be. He summoned his most trusted guard captain, a stoic wolf named Marcus whose loyalty was beyond question. The prisoner in the south dungeon, Kaelin commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Move her to the east tower chambers. Post a permanent guard. No one enters or leaves without my direct authority. She is a person of interest. Under my personal protection." Marcus's eyes widened fractionally at the unheard-of command, but he simply nodded. "Yes, Alpha King." As Marcus left, Kaelin walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard. He could feel her, a faint, flickering candle of life in the stone heart of his keep. And he swore to the moon and the stars, he would not let that flame be extinguished. The transition was jarring. One moment, Alara was embracing the resigned cold of the dungeon, the next, she was being escorted by silent, imposing guards up winding staircases to a room that was the antithesis of her cell. The East Tower chamber was opulent, furnished with a soft bed piled high with furs, a small hearth where a fire already crackled merrily, and a window overlooking the royal gardens. A gilded cage. The door closed behind her with the same definitive thud as the one in the dungeon, but this one had a small, barred grate. It was a prison cell masquerading as a guest room. A hulking guard, the one Kaelin had called Marcus, was stationed outside. His presence was a constant, oppressive weight. She was no longer a condemned traitor awaiting death, but something else. A piece on a game board she didn't understand. Kaelin's property. The thought sent a fresh wave of revulsion through her. She paced the room like a caged animal, the plush rug a mockery under her bare feet. Why this? Why move her from a dungeon to a luxurious prison? Was this some new form of psychological torture? To show her all she could have, all that was denied to her. The bond offered no answers, only a confusing hum of proximity. He was near. Somewhere in the keep, he was moving, breathing, and the invisible thread connecting them pulled taut. It was a maddening, intimate awareness of the man she was sworn to destroy. She hated it. She hated the way her wolf perked up, a hopeful fool, every time the energy in the bond shifted. She hated the traitorous part of her that felt safer. Protected. It was a lie. A trick of biology, of fated mate nonsense. The only safety lay in his death. Days blurred. Meals appeared outside her door, untouched. The old healer, Lyra, came once more, not to tend wounds, but to bring fresh linens and a pitcher of water. She said nothing, but her eyes were full of a patient, waiting sorrow. Elara tried to hate her too, for her cryptic words, for chipping away at the certainty that had been her shield. But the old woman's quiet kindness was impossible to despise. On the third night, sleep offered no escape. She was jolted awake by a nightmare of her family's last moments, their faces contorted in fear. She sat bolt upright, gasping, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the fire burned down to glowing embers. And he was there. Kaelin stood in the shadows near the door, a silhouette against the faint moonlight from the window. He hadn't made a sound. He wasn't dressed as a king, but in simple black trousers and a tunic, his feet bare. He looked less like a monarch and more like a predator in his own den. The air crackled with his presence, the bond flaring to life, a searing, painful line between them. "What do you want?" she breathed, her voice raspy. She scrambled back on the bed, pulling a fur blanket up to her chin like a shield. He didn't move. He just watched her, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't interrogating her. He was just watching. The intensity of his gaze was a physical touch, peeling back layers she thought were impenetrable. "Why?" His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the same question from her fractured memory of the throne room. The dam of her control, weakened by Lyra's words and the intimacy of this strange prison, finally broke. The grief and rage she had carried for a decade erupted. "Why?" she repeated, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek. "You dare ask me why? You, who signed the order. You, who had my mother and father dragged from their home. They were lawkeepers. They served this kingdom. And my sister, she was 6 years old. 6? Did she threaten your throne, you butcher? Did her bedtime stories keep you awake at night?" Tears streamed down her face, hot and furious. She was shaking, not with fear, but with the force of her own pain, finally unleashed upon its target. She expected him to lash out, to silence her with a snarl of alpha command. Instead, he flinched. It was a barely perceptible motion, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of raw agony in his eyes, but she saw it. He absorbed her words like blows, his powerful frame seeming to shrink under their weight. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend himself. He just stood there and took it, his face a mask of torment. The sight was more disorienting than any defense he could have mounted. Her tirade faltered, her breath catching on a sob. He took a single step forward, and she flinched back. He stopped immediately, holding up a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture of peace. He started, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He shook his head, the words dying in his throat. He looked at her for one more long, searing moment, his gaze filled with a world of regret. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. Elara was left alone in the sudden, ringing silence, her own screams still echoing in her ears. The bond pulsed with a grief so profound, so utterly devastating, that for the first time, she couldn't tell if it was his, or her own. Kaelin retreated to his study, the force of Elara's words hitting him like a physical assault. "Did her bedtime stories keep you awake at night?" The question echoed in the hollows of his soul. He had seen the truth of her pain, the raw, unvarnished agony of a child who had lost everything. And she had laid it all at his feet, where Rorik had intended it to land. His wolf snarled, demanding he hunt down the beater and tear the truth from his throat. But the king held the beast in check. A public confrontation was still too dangerous. He needed to be smarter. He summoned Rorik to the council chambers under the pretense of discussing trade disputes with the southern pacts. The room was empty save for the two of them, the great oak table stretching between them like a battlefield. Rorik entered with his customary swagger, a confident smile on his face. He was a handsome wolf, charismatic and well-liked, which made his treachery all the more venomous. "Kaelin," he began, his tone familiar, brotherly. "To what do I owe the late-night summons? The merchants from Sunstone Ridge are getting greedy again, I assume." Kaelin didn't invite him to sit. He remained standing, a silent, imposing figure near the hearth. "I was reviewing old decrees tonight, Rorik. It's a fascinating exercise. A history of our kingdom written in ink and wax." Rorik's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, caution, perhaps, entered his eyes. A noble pursuit for a king. Most would find it tedious. "I came across the Silver Moon Decree," Kaelin said, his voice deceptively casual. He watched Rorik's face, searching for the slightest crack in his facade. "A tragic affair. The plague that took them was so swift," he repeated the lie Rorik himself had crafted, tasting its foulness on his tongue. For the first time, Rorik looked uneasy. He shifted his weight. "Tragic indeed. A great loss of our history and lore. I did what I could to contain the outbreak, as you had commanded before your departure for the north. Quarantine the afflicted, burn the bodies to prevent its spread. It was unpleasant, he was good." His voice was laced with just the right amount of feigned regret. "Yes. You handled it," Kaelin said, his eyes narrowing. "Funny. I don't recall giving any such order about a plague. My last command to you was to fortify the eastern garrison and distribute grain reserves if the winter was harsh." He let the statement hang in the air. It wasn't an accusation, but a correction. A test. Rorik's mask of calm finally slipped. A flush crept up his neck. "Of course. That too. It was a chaotic time, Alpha. My memory of the precise sequence of events may be clouded by the stress of the situation." "My memory is not," Kaelin stated, his voice dropping, losing all its casualness and taking on the hard edge of command. "And I find myself wondering how a decree for execution by blade could be misremembered as a quarantine for a plague. I also find myself wondering how my seal, which was on my person in the Frostfang Mountains, ended up on a document here in the capital." Panic flashed in Rorik's eyes, stark and undeniable, before he masked it with indignation. "Are you accusing me of something, Kaelin? After all our years? I acted on the intelligence I was given. That the Silver Moons were plotting against you, that they were using ancient magic to aid the Frostfang rebels. It was another lie, a new layer to the deception, crafted on the spot. But it was a fatal misstep." Kaelin hadn't mentioned an execution. He'd only mentioned the decree. Rorik had just admitted its true nature. "I see," Kaelin said softly, the two words laced with deadly finality. He had him. He had the confession, albeit an indirect one. But it wasn't enough to sway a council full of Rorik's cronies. He needed more. He needed the forger. He needed the guards who carried out the order. And he needed to protect Alara, who was now in more danger than ever. "Your loyalty is noted, Beta," Kaelin said, turning away, a clear dismissal. The feigned trust was a bitter acid in his throat. "You may go." Rorik hesitated, suspicion and fear warring on his face. He clearly didn't know how much Kaelin knew, but he knew it was too much. He gave a stiff, formal bow. Alpha King. As he retreated from the room, Kaelin met his own reflection in the dark, polished wood of the table. He saw the fury in his own eyes, the promise of bloodshed. Rorik would be scrambling now. He would see Alara, the living, breathing loose end, as a primary threat. He would make a move against her. And when he did, Kaelin would be waiting. The king's gambit was played. Now it was the wolf's turn to hunt. The next evening, Kalen went to her again. This time, he didn't slip in like a shadow. He had the guards unlock the door and entered with a tray of food, roast chicken, fresh bread, a small bowl of berries. It was the meal he'd been served for his own dinner. An offering. A peace treaty she had no reason to accept. She was huddled by the window, staring out into the twilight, a lone, defiant figure. She didn't turn as he entered, but he felt the immediate tensing of her body, the spike of fear and anger through the bond. He set the tray on a small table. "You need to eat." Her voice was ice. "I'd rather starve than eat your food." "It's not my food. It's the castle's. You are a guest here, not a prisoner," he lied, the words feeling hollow even to him. She finally turned, her face pale in the dim light, her eyes blazing. "A guest? Do your guests have armed guards outside their doors? Am I free to leave this room? To walk out of this keep and never return?" Her questions were daggers, and he had no shield against them. "No," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Not yet." "Then I am a prisoner," she advanced on him, her small frame radiating a fury that rivaled his own. "And you are my jailer. The murderer of my family. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending this is anything else." He had to tell her. He couldn't bear another moment of her believing this lie. Rorik was already moving, he could feel the shift in the keep's political currents. She needed to know the truth, not just for the sake of the bond, but for her own survival. "Your family was murdered," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But not by me." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Oh, of course. The great Alpha King is blameless. The decree with your name and seal just appeared out of thin air." It was forged. He took a step closer, his hands open at his sides, showing he meant no harm. "Rorik. My beater. He oversaw the capital while I was fighting in the north. He issued the order. He created the lie about the plague to cover his crime. He did it to weaken my reign, to remove a lineage loyal to my father, and to create a weapon of vengeance he could one day point at my heart." He paused, his gaze boring into hers. "You, Elara. That weapon was you." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He could see the struggle in her eyes. The desperate desire to believe him warring with a decade of carefully nurtured hate. "Lies," she whispered, but the word lacked conviction. "It was a shield full of holes." "Is it?" He reached into his tunic and pulled out 2 pieces of parchment. One was the forged decree from Rorik. The other was a simple trade agreement he had signed that morning. He held them out to her. Look. Look at the signature. The forgery is nearly perfect, but the pressure is wrong. The loop on the K is too tight. I pressed down on the final stroke." He didn't know that. She hesitated, her gaze darting from the parchments to his face. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible string, she stepped forward and took them from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt of pure energy, warm and electric, shot up his arm. She snatched her hand back as if burned. She held the documents to the firelight, her eyes scanning the script, comparing, analyzing. He could see the moment the truth dawned. Her face crumpled. The parchment slipped from her nerveless fingers and fluttered to the floor. "No," she breathed, shaking her head in denial. "No, it can't be." Her entire reality, the very foundation of her identity for the last 10 years, was sand falling through her fingers. The object of her hate, the focus of her life's mission, was not her enemy. He was a victim, just as she was. The grief that followed was not the clean, sharp blade of vengeful sorrow she was used to. It was a messy, confusing, suffocating wave of guilt and loss. She had tried to kill an innocent man. The wrong man. Her mate. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, animal sound of utter devastation. She staggered back, her legs giving way. Kalen moved instinctively, catching her before she hit the floor, pulling her against his chest. She was rigid at first, her fists beating weakly against him. No, no, but then the fight went out of her, replaced by a storm of weeping. She collapsed against him, her tears soaking his tunic, her body shaking with the force of her shattered world. He held her, his arms a protective circle, his own heart aching with her pain. He didn't speak. There were no words for this. He just held his mate as she grieved, not just for the family she had lost, but for the truth she had just been forced to find. The fragile piece of their shared grief was shattered by the splintering crash of the door. Rorik stood in the doorway, flanked by two of his most loyal council guards, their faces grim. He hadn't bothered with subtlety. This was a direct challenge. His eyes, cold and reptilian, landed on Alara in Kalen's arms, and a sneer twisted his lips. So, the rumors are true, Rorik said, his voice dripping with venom. The king beds his would-be assassin. How touching. And how treasonous, he pointed a finger at Alara. She is a convicted traitor. She tried to murder our Alpha King. I am here to see that the council's sentence is carried out. Public execution. Now? Kalen carefully set Alara behind him, shielding her with his body. His stance shifted, his muscles coiling. The Alpha King was gone, replaced by the primal, territorial wolf. You will not touch her, Rorik. The words were a low growl, a promise of death. I am the beater of this pack. Rorik snarled, taking a step into the room. It is my duty to uphold the law when the Alpha is compromised. He was playing to the guards, to the inevitable audience this confrontation would draw. He was painting Kalen as a lovesick fool, controlled by a treacherous mate. The only one compromised here is you, Kalen retorted, his golden eyes burning with cold fire. You, who forged my seal. You, who murdered the Silver Moons. You, who sent this girl to do your dirty work. Rorik laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Your word against mine. And you are holding the assassin in your arms. Who do you think the pack will believe? He gave a sharp nod to his guards. Seize her. The two guards lunged forward. Kalen met them, a blow of black-clad fury. He moved with a speed and brutality that was terrifying to behold. The first guard's attack was met with a bone-jarring block, followed by a swift, precise strike to the throat that sent him crumpling to the floor, gagging. The second guard was more cautious, brandishing a silver knife, but Kalen was a force of nature. He disarmed him with contemptuous ease, the knife spinning away to clatter in a corner, and a powerful shove sent the wolf crashing into the wall. But it was a diversion. While Kalen was occupied, Rorik lunged for Alara. His hand closed around her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. You are my key to the throne, little Moonshadow, he hissed, dragging her toward the door. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. But then something else rose up to meet it. Not the blind rage of before, but a cold, clear fury. The truth had set something free inside her. She was not a weapon. She was a silver moon. Her mother's words from a lifetime ago echoed in her mind, our blood is not of the claw, but of the light. We do not break things, my love. We reveal them. As Rorik yanked her into the hallway, she reached for that inner core, a part of her she hadn't touched since she was a child. She focused on the torches lining the corridor, on the light they cast. She pulled at it with her will, her grief, her rage. For a split second, the hallway plunged into absolute, disorienting darkness. Rorik cried out in surprise, his grip faltering. In that single moment of hesitation, Kalen was on him. He slammed into his beater with the force of a battering ram, sending both of them tumbling to the stone floor. The fight was no longer a display of skill, it was a savage, desperate battle between two apex predators. Snarls and growls echoed through the keep as wolves, drawn by the commotion, began to fill the corridor. They saw their alpha and their beta locked in a bloody struggle, a sight that struck fear into the heart of the pack. Kaelin was stronger, but Rorik was fueled by the desperation of a cornered snake. He managed to land a vicious slash across Kaelin's ribs with a dagger hidden in his boot. Kaelin roared in pain and rage, the scent of his own blood filling the air. He retaliated, his own claws extending, and drove Rorik back. Elara, standing clear of the fight, saw her chance. She saw the silver knife the guard had dropped, lying near the wall. But she didn't pick it up. Instead, she looked at the assembled crowd of wolves, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. She raised her voice, clear and ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "He lies," she shouted, pointing at Rorik, who was now pinned beneath a furious Kaelin. "Rorik of the Red Creek murdered my family. He forged the king's seal. He told me Kaelin was the butcher, all to turn me against him. He is the traitor." Rorik, his face bloody, spat at her. Lies from a killer's mouth. But it was too late. Lyra, the old healer, pushed her way to the front of the crowd. In her hand, she held a tarnished silver locket. "This was found on the body of one of the guards who carried out the purge," she announced, her voice trembling but firm. "He confessed before he died of his wounds, racked with guilt. He said the order came not from the king, but from the beta." She opened the locket. Inside was Rorik's family crest. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The truth was out, undeniable and stark. Rorik's allies in the crowd took a visible step back, disassociating themselves from him. His power base crumbled to dust in an instant. Kaelin, bleeding from the gash in his side, rose to his full height, planting a foot on Rorik's chest. The fight was over. Justice, swift and brutal, was about to be served. Kaelin stood over his defeated beta, his chest heaving, the scent of his own blood sharp in the air. The corridor was packed with the silent, stunned members of his court. Their eyes darted from the bleeding king to the exposed traitor on the floor, to the small, defiant woman who had brought the truth to light. Rorik's reign of whispers and shadows was over. Kaelin's gaze, however, was fixed on Elara. The raw, primal fury of the fight receded, replaced by something far more profound. He saw her, truly saw her, not as an assassin or a victim, but as the brave, powerful woman who had faced down her own demons and spoken truth to power. He was the Alpha King. By law and by right, she was his. He could make the claim now, a public declaration that would bind her to him forever, cementing his victory and her place at his side. The pack expected it. The ancient laws demanded it. But as he looked into her eyes, weary, exhausted, but shining with a newfound strength, he saw the trap in that. To claim her now would be another form of imprisonment, an assertion of power, not partnership. It would make a mockery of the agency she had just fought so hard to reclaim. So he did nothing. He stood, bleeding and victorious, and simply waited. He held her gaze, and in the space between them, an unspoken question hung in the air. "What do you choose?" He offered her not a command, but a choice. His silence was a greater testament of his respect for her than any proclamation could ever be. Elara's heart hammered in her chest. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. She saw the path laid out for her, the power, the safety, the title of Lunar Queen. It was all there for the taking. But she also saw the man. The wolf who had taken her rage and not returned it. The king who had sought truth instead of vengeance. The mate who had honored her with a choice when he could have simply taken. Her hatred for him had been a lie, but the bond was not. It was a real, living thing, and it now pulsed not with pain, but with a burgeoning, terrifying hope. Slowly, deliberately, she walked across the stone floor, her bare feet making no sound. She moved past the defeated Rorik without a glance, past the curious eyes of the court, until she stood directly in front of Kaelin. She looked at the deep gash in his side, welling with dark blood. Without a word, she reached out, not to touch his face or his hand, but to gently press the heel of her palm against the wound, applying pressure. It was a healer's gesture. A protector's. An equal's. She looked up at him, her expression clear. "You're bleeding," she said softly, the simple words carrying the weight of her decision. In front of the entire pack, she chose not the throne, but the man. She chose partnership. A quiet sigh of relief and understanding rippled through the crowd. This was not a claiming. This was an acceptance. Later, in the quiet of his private chambers, the world was stripped away, leaving only the two of them. Lyra had stitched the wound, her fingers nimble and sure, before leaving them in peace. Elara now dabbed at the edges of the injury, with a cloth soaked in a cleansing herbal wash. The air was thick with the scents of blood, antiseptic herbs, and the overwhelming, comforting aroma of their shared bond finally at peace. Kaelin sat on the edge of his bed, watching her every movement. Her touch was gentle, focused, her brow furrowed in concentration. For 10 years, he had been a king, a warrior, an alpha. He had forgotten what it felt like to simply be cared for. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. She didn't look up from her task. "You would have done the same for me, it wasn't a question." He reached out, his fingers gently touching her chin, tilting her face up to his. Her eyes were still shadowed with a decade of grief, but the sharp edges of hate were gone, replaced by a deep, soulful exhaustion. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "What Rorik did, the years you lost. I can never give them back to you. I can offer you justice. His life is forfeit. His allies will be stripped of their rank and lands. The Silver Moon name will be restored, honored." He paused. "I can give you a crown. A title. A home. Anything you want. You have only to ask." She finished cleaning the wound and set the cloth aside. She looked at his hand, still holding her chin, and slowly, she covered it with her own. Her skin was warm against his. "I don't want a crown," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And I already have a home. What's left of it? My family's lands are overgrown, the archives likely plundered or destroyed. I want to go back. I want to rebuild. I want to honor them not with vengeance, but with life." His heart clenched. She was choosing to leave. After everything, she was choosing to walk away. The wolf inside him whimpered at the thought of the separation. But then she met his gaze, and a small, hesitant smile touched her lips for the very first time. "Rebuilding is hard work. I imagine I'll need help. A strong alpha, perhaps. One who knows how to fortify a territory." Relief, potent and dizzying, washed over him. She wasn't leaving him. She was inviting him into her future. A future she was building, on her own terms. "I think," he said, his own smile finally breaking free, "that can be arranged." He leaned in, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. She met him halfway, her eyes fluttering shut as his lips met hers. The kiss wasn't the fiery, desperate claiming of a fated mate. It was soft. It was tender. It was a promise. A beginning, built not on fate or destiny, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of a choice, freely made in the wake of sorrow, and a truth, finally brought into the light. Justice would come with the dawn. But healing had already begun.